Hi everybody, it's Leah with Family Heritage Living. I thought I'd do another reading today. I actually had a viewer give me a suggestion I hadn't thought about before, and I thought it was a really good one. They had mentioned that it was an enjoyable read, but they'd enjoy it more if there was photos. Now, that can be done on some of the readings I do. Some of them, they're not really specific enough, except for maybe photos for the specific time era. But I thought it was a really good idea. And this particular reading that I'm going to do is probably going to be like picture overload for parts of it, just because it talks about farm life and it talks about items, everyday items that were used. In fact, a lot of these items are everyday items that we use in our lifestyle. And it's kind of nice for me. I love my sister and I so appreciate her opening her home to us, but there's no place like home. And you know, we're sisters. People have different decorating styles and stuff, and of course she lives in a modern home. So to get an opportunity to kind of look at things and put these pictures in here is kind of like a little trip home for me right now. So that's kind of fun. So I just want to thank the viewer that suggested that, because I really appreciate that idea. And again, I can't do it for every video, but I certainly can try to do it for some of them. And we're going to see how this one goes. It is a lot more time consuming to do that, but I do think it definitely would add to the content of the reading. And because so many items from this time period that I've been reading about are common to us, I don't always think about that many of our viewers aren't aware of what they're talking about. So I think too that would be beneficial. Okay, so this particular story was written about the First World War. And it's kind of a funny thing, because I just started listening to a podcast on the Spanish flu and well, what we refer to as the Spanish flu. And of course we know that it started during the same time period as World War I was going on. It was also spread exponentially in areas because of the troops and stuff being in such close quarters. So it was kind of interesting that I came across this story at the same time I started that podcast. During World War I, my father was a soldier overseas. My mother went to work as a waitress in a restaurant in Kansas City, Missouri. I was sent to live with my grandparents on a small farm a few miles out of Diedrichs. The farmhouse had 2 upstairs bedrooms, very hot in the summer, but in the winter, as we went to bed, we would take a heated rock wrapped in an old woolen cloth to put at our feet during the long, cold winter nights. Now, we use soapstones or hot water bottles. Ron's favorite is hot water bottles, and they actually, the old hot water bottles, and I'll see if I can find a picture here, were actually made out of like a crock, but they had a cork in it. And of course, hot water bottles of today are made out of, well, they were made out of real rubber. They're slightly different now. We had a couple of really nice old ones and had to replace them, and we're not quite as fond of them as we were the old ones. But our soapstones, as you see pictured here, that's what sinks are made out of, or what we know soapstone sinks are made out of. And they heat up really nice, and they retain the heat, and then you just wrap them in a towel, as they mentioned here with rocks. Rocks do work as well. We would take a heated rock, wrap it in an old woolen cloth to put at our feet during the long cold nights. Now, the reason they would use wool, same reason you use wool lots of times when you're making a compress or flannel, is it retains the heat. It keeps that warmth. The big parlor downstairs had an old-fashioned organ with stops to pull out and pedals to pump as you played it, and a big Franklin heating stove with Iselin glass windows, nickel trim, and kept a shiny black. The blinds in this room were usually kept drawn unless we had company or someone was sick or hurt, and lay on the horse-haired stuffed couch waiting for a doctor to come. Interesting note about those organs. A lot of people are turning them into desks. And in fact, Ron had picked one up in order to do that for me, to turn it into a desk, because they look really cool. I've also seen them used as a coffee station for the more to do, I guess, or the more in group. You'll see it, they really, you can get them really cheap. Lots of times you can get them for free just because of the weight. But it's kind of a neat way to have a piece of the past, yet something that most people aren't going to use today. In the next room, the heavy dining furniture was used only at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, for company meals, or when the minister stayed with us a few days while he held an arbor meeting in our pasture and a baptism in our creek. Any other time we ate in the kitchen at a big square table covered with oilcloth. The condiments were left on the table, and after each meal cleanup, a certain large cloth was used to cover everything up. The big black kitchen range was the source of our existence, and that is so true. Our stove is the heart of our home. I mean, it is, you've heard me speak in videos, it is the workhorse of the house. It heats the house, it cooks the food, it heats the water. It is the main tool of the home. There was always a large pot of coffee at one side. The reservoir at the back was our constant supply of hot water for cooking, cleaning, and bathing, and we did it in a big tub, hunched down near the stove for needed warmth in the wintertime. In a corner was a wood box that seemed to be bottomless when I had to carry in load after armload of wood to keep it full. There was a Hoover, she calls it a Hoover, I think she means Hoosier, cabinet that held flour, shortening, eggs, spice, molasses, sugar, a bread box, a cookie jar, a big crock of Clabber milk, and most everything you need to fix a meal. By the back door was a washstand with a filled bucket, a dipper, and wash basin. On the wall, in its own case, a hung roller towel that you pulled down towards you to get a clean place to dry your face and hands. The Hoosier cabinets, we have a series on those that we've had started, and they really were convenient, and they were very popular, becoming very popular at that time. They were very popular. It was the height of their popularity in the early 1900s to the 1920s, shortly thereafter. So there were so many cabinets made that hundreds of thousands of them exist today in really good shape, that I just thought it'd be fun to look over some of the pictures of different styles of Hoosier cabinets here for just a second that you might find in any home, not just farm homes, but city homes, apartments. They used to make apartment size Hoosier cabinets too, they're really neat. They're really rare to find. Once a week was a bake day, and how good the kitchen used to smell. A cake using pure butter and cream, some cookies, pies, salt rising or sourdough bread. She never used a cookbook. She just seemed to know exactly how much to put in and mix everything with her hands. Oh, that wonderful home-baked light bread. Always the big, beautiful brown, humped in the outside, fragrantly white inside, and so luscious, hunked off while hot, with a great gob of sweet, fresh churned butter. I helped with the churning. We would skim milk off the top of the crocks of milk, put it in the churn, and with the lid on, I would move the dasher up and down for the longest time while the butter formed. Then Grandma would work it, getting the rest of the buttermilk out, salt it, shape it, and wrap it in a white square cloth. That buttermilk was good too. We saved some of it for drinking and cooking, but mostly it was used for slopping the hogs. If you have a notion to make homemade butter, a churn is not necessary. It's great for larger quantities of cream, but for just the occasional, to try it, to let your kids get a feel for it, or for if you just want to pick up some cream and do it yourself, just put it in a canning jar, put the lid on, and just shake it back and forth like that. That motion will create that cream to separate. The milk will separate and the cream will turn into butter. And it's just kind of an amazing process to watch, because the butter does get a yellow tint. The milk does separate. A couple of tips if you do try this. You pour off your buttermilk and then take your cream or take your butter and put it in a bowl, a rounded bowl, and a flat bottom spoon, and press against it to get more of that cream out. And then you can go ahead and you can rinse that butter, because that butter is going to be pliable by this time. So if you just rinse it lightly under water to help get that excess cream out, you're not like kneading it under there. You're just kind of rinsing it, patting it a little bit. Then go ahead and pat it dry. Put it back in the bowl. Maybe even try to pat it again, like with a spoon or with a towel, and then put a little salt in there. It's just the funnest thing to do with kids. If it's something that you don't normally do, then it's just something you want to try. I was allowed to gather the eggs from the hen house, or the hayloft, or wherever we knew of the hen hiding her nest. In those nests, I would always put a glass egg to replace hers and keep her laying there. We had a few guinea hens, and they would always try to hide their nest. If we were lucky and found them in time, we would have the cutest little guinea chicks, but hawks and crows and all kinds of varmints would always catch most of these little chicks way out in the fields, despite the hens' anxious put-rack, put-rack, puck-rack. Guinea hens make the most awfulest sound. We saved what eggs we did not use for ourselves until we had a certain number of dozens. Grandma would kill some of her fat hens that were not laying, dress them, which meant remove the feathers, single, and wash them till they looked real nice. She would pick some of her nicest vegetables from her garden. We would take the vegetables, the chickens, some butter, and eggs, and put them in the buggy, hitch up old Prince, and drive him into Diedrich's, where she would exchange these things for the staples we needed at home. Spring times, she would take me into the woods mushroom hunting. She always knew just when and where the plants stuck their tender shoots through the fallen leaves. We always took a spring tonic of sulfur and molasses to clean our blood. Along with this, we always ate messes of wild mustard greens, young dandelions, and tender lamb quarters. Her garden was the envy of all our neighbors. It seemed she could raise almost any vegetable you could think of. In the fall, Grandpa would dig a big hole, line it with straw, put in potatoes, parsnips, turnips, cabbage, beets, carrots, and the like, cover these with more straw, then with earth, and they did not freeze, but were ever so nice and fresh when dug up in the wintertime. And that's very true. They do work like that. In fact, you can winter cabbage outside if they're under glass. You can winter a lot of things outside under glass, even with snow falling and stuff. When I first came to the farm, Henny the farm dog adopted me and helped me get acquainted with everything on the whole place, from the house yard filled with flowers over the 3-stone step stile into the barnyard, into the barn where the cows were milked and the horses were bedded down at night, and down the hill past the pig pen, over the stone steps, through the creek, by the fenced cornfield, up to the pasture where the horses and cows grazed. I picked many wildflowers in this meadow. Also during the summer there were sweet little wild strawberries hidden in the tall grasses. Evenings I would go up there to drive the cows home for milking. Henny, always with me, would sometimes find coveys of quail, and up in the air they would whirl, making a scarily rustling noise. Once he found a burrow of tiny pink naked baby rabbits. All on the creek were grapevines, blackberry bushes, and the wild cherry trees. In the fall we gathered hazelnuts, black walnuts, pecans, and wild persimmons. We made a butter of these, a layer of fruit, a layer of sugar until the crock was filled, then put a plate on top, weighed down with a clean rock. This was kept in the storm cellar near the back door. The cellar always had drinking water, a cot with bedding, warm clothes, a lantern, always filled with the preparations for a bad storm. The cellar kept the milk cool. Eggs were stored here as well as large barrels of salted pork, crocks of sauerkraut, jugs of homemade elderberry, and grape wine and vinegar. Shelf after shelf held many jars of fruit, vegetables of all kinds that had been put up from the orchards of her big garden. Grandpa made a trap from a box and some sticks that would set in a figure 4. I caught birds, rabbits, a coon, a possum, and once a cute little half-grown skunk. Grandma let me go squirrel hunting with him, and many times I would walk around the tree to make the squirrel go to the other side of the tree so he could shoot it. We got dozens of quail and roasted them in the bread pans. We would gather pawpaws and eat them like bananas. On the north side of the house was our smokehouse, where after a neighborhood gathering to do the fall butchering, the cloth-covered meats were hung from rafters, and a slow fire kept burning in a large metal drum setting on some bricks. Sometimes the smoke wood was hickory and sometimes apple, but whatever it was, the long, slow smoking filled that room and cured the meats in a taste and flavor never achieved in the commercially cured meats of this day and time. I do want to put a word of warning in here. Life was really different back then. And the things that, especially if you've never raised animals for your food, if you're a vegetarian or a vegan, a lot of survival, a lot of getting the yearly needs or the daily needs were done through butchering. It's not, you didn't go to a store and you weren't disconnected from what you were consuming. What you consumed was what you had known. You had literally, you'd known it. If it were animal, you knew it, you cared for it, you took care of it, and then you butchered it. So I just want to put this disclaimer in here that she's pretty vivid about the processing of some hogs that they had, and it might be a little bit more than you care to hear if there's any reason you don't eat meat or if you have young children. Speaking of butchering, early on a cold fall day, the neighbors would come to our farm. They would make big rows of fires and heat many kettles and pots of water. With sawhorse and board, they would make tables to work on. When the water was boiling, it was poured into a large trough. The men would drive the hog one by one up a certain place where they would stick it with a sharp knife, bled them, and dip them in a vat of hot water. They would spread its hind legs with a single tree and hoist it up on a pole between the two trees, so the men would work around it. They would scrape the hair off, split it from tail to neck, clean the entrails out into a tub, wash the carcass, and let it cool a bit. From the tubs of entrails, they took the hearts, livers, melts, and removed all the bits of fat for rendering. They even washed some of the intestines inside and out for casings for the sausage. Then they would cut hams and shoulders in pieces that were to be bacon from the carcass and put them on the tables where the women trimmed off all of the excess fat and put it in a heavy pot. They washed the meat and wrapped it in clean pieces of flour sacks. All the scraps and certain pieces of meat were put in one tub to be ground up with spices and seasonings for sausage. When the heavy cast iron pot was filled with the fat trimmings, two men lifted it on a big rack over a fire. One woman had the job of stirring this with a wooden paddle. As the fat rendered on, it was the only thing about these doings that smelled good. This took a long time, and the shrunken pieces of fat were skimmed out and saved for crackling bread and things like that. I was supposed to keep this fire going by carefully pushing sticks of wood into it under the pot so the ashes would not be stirred up and blow into the melting fat. Those cracklings were saved to be divided among all the workers, together with spare ribs, neck bones, hearts, livers, tails, feet, jowls, ears, and heads. Nothing was wasted. Some of the side meat were put in a big barrel for salt curing. I was promised if I would be real good and not get in anyone's way, and if I kept that one fire going, as I had been shown to do, I could have all the balloons. I wonder how many know what that meant. I played with those hog bladder balloons a long time after the butchering was over. Once, we drove Prince hitched to the buggy to Appleton City, Missouri for a 4th of July celebration. On the way, we stopped at Excelsior Springs, Missouri, where at one place water came bubbling out of the ground from a big pipe-like fountain. The grown-ups drank some of this, but the awful sulfur smell was enough for me. By the time we got to Appleton City, we were very hungry. We went to a restaurant on the main street and sat at the table, utterly fascinated by the tall white pillars along the walls. When the pretty waitress came to take our orders, I decided right then and there, when I grew up, I was going to be a waitress. After we had eaten, we went out to the fairgrounds, where the main attraction that afternoon was a balloon ascension. It was exciting to see the big balloon with the little basket underneath it held to it by ropes and a man standing in the basket. There were other ropes hanging down, and men were holding the balloons in a certain position with these. Suddenly, at some signal, all the men let go of the ropes, and the balloon basket, ropes trailing, and the man waving, went up, up, and away. When it got dark, they had a beautiful display of fireworks. By the time that was over, I was so tired, Grandpa wrapped me in a quilt and lifted me into the buggy. Snuggled down between them as they started home, I was soon fast asleep and knew nothing of the homeward trip. For when I awoke in my own bed, it was another day. In December, my Uncle William and Aunt Lily arrived for a month's visit. They had began talking about Santa Claus coming and what did I want him to bring me, and what he would bring me if I was a good little girl. I told them that Santa did not know me, and that my mother had always told me he was not going to bring anything to any poor people that he did not know. Their comments were, "Poor little tyke," and "Well, we'll see about that." The night before Christmas, after reminding me to hang up my stocking, they sent me to bed with my hot rock. I cuddled down in my feather bed, and it seemed I had just got to sleep when they called me to come and see who was here. I came sleepily down the stairs, my little flannel gown dragging a little. I entered the parlor, warm and bright from a roaring log in the fireplace. Aunt Lily looked up and said, "Oh, honey, you just missed him. He's going out the door right now." I looked out at the door, and sure enough, I saw just a red sleeves with a hand shutting the door. But there, swinging from the front doorknob, fastened with a straight pin, was my long black stocking. Instead of hanging limply as it did last night from the fireplace mantel, it was now bulging and lumpy all the way down. I unfastened it and sat down by the fire in my own little chair to examine the contents. At the top was a big, beautiful orange, the first I'd ever had, a shiny spinning top, a little mouth harp, some peanut almonds and English walnuts, some big pieces of brightly colored ribbon candy, a pretty little sewing kit, and oh, the wonderful things that were in that stocking. I sat there in the firelight, all these things, not noticing the flickering lights in the corner. My Uncle William came into the parlor from the dining room, hiding something red in his pocket, and he said, "Little Lily, look over there in the corner." I looked, and there, almost touching the tall ceiling, was the prettiest green tree. Grandpa, Grandma, and Aunt Lily were busy lighting all the little wax candles in their metal clamp holders. There were great strings of cranberries and popcorn looped all over the tree. Here and there on the branches were cute little artificial birds, an angel at the top, and over the back were spread fluffy clouds of angel hair. Under the tree were presents for everyone. I just couldn't believe all this was for us. My first store-bought doll with a real china head and hands. Oh, it was wonderful. I really believe that Santa now knew me. Everyone was so happy for and with me. There has never ever again been as happy a Christmas morning for me. Even with our own children's surprised, wondering eyes on their Christmas mornings, nor in our dear grandchild's delight at their Christmas time, nothing will ever compare with that morning long ago when I really believed that Santa Claus did know me and really had come to see me. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story. It was a long one, to be sure. But until next time, take care. God bless.